federal policy and equity at Lumina Foundation. But I am very excited to facilitate this conversation as a researcher that focuses primarily in higher education and policy, but again, thinking about how student activism, how movement building, how do we make sure people and movements are captured in institutional archives and other places. So I'm going to share a little bit about your fantastic fabulousness. And then after that, we'll have some remarks, 5 to 7 minutes from Dr. Kuumba and Dr. Myrick-Harris, and then again, leading into conversation. Just for our flag for the fellows, we will have an additional half hour after this hour for you to engage in conversation. So if there are some reactions or things in the chat that you want to leave during the hour to come back to, we welcome that engagement too. So first, Dr. Bahati Kuumba is a scholar activist who holds the positions of Professor of Comparative Women's Studies and Associate Director of the Women's Research and Resource Center at Spelman College. She is a co-founding faculty facilitator for the Tony Cade Bombara Scholars, Writers, Activists, which is a student engagement project of the Women's Center. Her scholarly research, activism, publications, and public talks focus on African and African diasporan women transnationally in the areas of social activism, resistance movements, reproductive justice, and global African Black feminist praxis. She has founded and or participated in a range of social justice organizations and campaigns, including Project South. I'm going to mispronounce this, so please forgive my tongue. Venceremos Brigade?
The Venceremos Brigade.
Venceremos Brigade.
Yes, we will win.
Ooh. Thank you for correcting that. Human Rights Atlanta and Women Engage. Again, there's just so much more to learn. And again, really looking forward to hearing your remarks. And before I turn it over to Dr. Kuumba, I want to share a few words about Dr. Myrick-Harris, who is the chair of Humanities Division and professor of Africana Studies at Morehouse College. She is the convener of the committee to commemorate the Atlanta Student Movement, which has developed the Atlanta Student Movement Initiative to share the stories and lessons of student activism of the 1960s with young activists fighting against social injustices of today. This initiative includes a series of intergenerational conversations, which were launched just a year ago. And we are excited to hear how those conversations have moved into symposium that was planned or will be planned for this year. Dr. Kuumba, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And I'm really excited and honored to have been asked to speak and participate in Project Stand, because I think it's so important that we document our activism. And a lot of the activism I've been engaged in over the years has not been documented. I'll mention why, I'll talk about why, and maybe get some feedback from you all about how we can correct that problem. So I thought I would start off with just talking about scholar activism and then my own personal trajectory with respect to scholarship and activism, and then how that's translated into my life at Spelman. So I consider scholar activism a lifelong project, first of all. It's been a lifelong project for me. And it's been a parallel path that I think I've been able to meld together only now at this later stage. For scholar activists, knowledge production is empty as an exercise if it's not connected in some conscious way to the real world. The goal from this manner of thinking is not merely to understand the world, but to change it. My path on terms of social change, I would say, came from my mama. Like the song about booties, she got it from her mama. Got it from my mama. In social movement theory, the idea of cognitive liberation is where you realize, you're in the midst of change. You realize that you can be an agent of change. And I credit my mother and I with stopping the only girls only wear dresses policy at Irving Elementary School, where we rebelled against Mr. Frazier, the principal, by wearing our pantsuits proudly until, of course, he had to change the rule and girls and boys could wear what we wanted. So I chart my initial cognitive liberation from my mama. But after that, there were seeds of radicalism, and they started in school. They weren't always fortified or nurtured in the classroom, but as a entering student in 1979 at University of Chicago, I was introduced to the apartheid and the apartheid regime and the anti-apartheid solidarity movement. And I, just like many other women of African descent around the world, that was a moment of cognitive liberation, of consciousness raising. And so from there, from being introduced to leftist politics, to international solidarity, to Pan-Africanism, because about 3 years later, I joined and would be a member of the All African People's Revolutionary Party and the All African Women's Revolutionary Union for about the next 15 years, where I had the opportunity not only to broaden, my intellectual work on apartheid and on social movements, but also my knowledge from the streets. So in Project South, we talk about taking our, from the ivory tower, from the streets, of course, to the ivory towers is where much of our teaching in women's studies, in Africana studies, in Chicana studies, all of these, of course, came from the streets into the ivory tower. But some of us never left the streets, and some of us tried to link the streets to the ivory tower. And that's been part of my project. So from the AAPRP, I continued to expand and work with the U.S.-Cuba Women's Exchange that was part of the Vincent Amos Brigade as a graduate student, working with Human Rights Atlanta here in Atlanta, helping co-found Project South, the Institute for the Elimination of Poverty and Genocide. And even though I'm not still currently a member of those particular organizations, I continue to attempt to link the Women's Research and Resource Center and Spelman College and the students to those and other organizations in which students can be active. That's a little of my personal trajectory. Since I've been at Spelman College, however, I have realized myself as a student activist advocate. And that includes my faculty advisement of several student organizations. And, this project has had me think about what those organizations were and what they meant. So over the years, well, actually, let me start currently with the student organizations that I currently advise, which include Africity, which is our Spelman College's LGBTQIA plus and allies organization, the Feminist Majority Leadership Alliance, which I would add was the organization responsible for raising the issue around Nellie in 2004 with what have been, termed now as the Nellie protests. And just to say that those few, it was a few scholar activists that were brave enough to not only stand up to Nellie, but also to Spelman College. And so in this, I guess, in my positioning now relative to student activism, sometimes play the role of guard, sometimes play the role of attempting to, I guess, how would I say, cover for some of their more productive activist missions that may not be in line with what the institution wants to do, and we can talk about that later too. But also the Tony Cade Bombera Scholars, Writers, Activists Collective, which I co-founded with a student, Malika Redmond, who now is the CEO of her own activist organization, Women Engaged. But we have ongoing discussions, almost like what I used to do in the All African People's Revolutionary Party, where we would have work study every 2 weeks, reading 70 pages, talking about geopolitical politics or geopolitics, and also looking at the question of African women. So the Tony Cade Bombera Collective, which meets about under pre-COVID circumstances, meet about every 2 weeks, and we would bring in Black feminist scholar activists from around the world to talk about their work, to engage the students, and the students in turn creating their own activist projects and or getting help with activist projects they were already engaged in from the knowledge they received. And as stands for, we attempt to document all of those conversations for later access, use, consciousness raising, et cetera. But in the past, we've had, as you know, student organizations ebb and flow on college campuses. And we've had our fair share of student organizations that have come and gone. And some of them we want to revive, like Students for Justice in Palestine, where we see an even greater need to be educated around the Palestinian struggle and have solidarity with Palestinian women. We had at one point the AUC Peace. We were reminded just recently of September 11th. This organization was the Iraq War and actually joined where Spelman, Morehouse, Clark, Atlanta students joined together to protest. We've also had Women United in Faith and Freedom, and which, of course, as it sounds, was contested the patriarchal notions of faith that oftentimes permeate our institutions, and Sister Fire, which I also want to revive, which was the women's only open mic that students in the Women's Center started after being really frustrated with the misogyny that they heard at the general, open mics that students were going to. So part of my in advising, I've also, and Holly Smith, who, thank you, Holly, again, for bringing me into this project, reminded me of a service that I performed, and I kind of fell into it accidentally, which is my office has become the wild archives for student activism on campus, meaning I can go to a shelf and pull out an original document from Africiti's first day of silence in 2002 with its, raggedy edges and everything that still states the demands, still unmet demands that the LGBTQ students in Spelman made of the administration. And it's always good to bring out and remind students about what they're fighting for and what they still need to achieve. So as the keeper of the wild archives on student activism at Spelman, I kind of see that as one of my main crowning glories, I guess you could say. And I'll leave it at that because I was like about 5 to 7 minutes and open to any other directions we want to take the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And we're going to come back to the Wild Archives because Holly mentioned it. And, I have a couple of thoughts percolating as I have my own home Wild Archive too. So I'm going to use that for myself. Dr. Myrick-Harris, I welcome you to join and share your wisdom with us today.
Thank you. And let me also say hello to my colleague, Dr. Kuumba. I think it's been years, not decades, since we have really seen each other. So very good to see you.
Yes, hi.
What's that?
Hi, long time no see, and good to see you too.
Yes. And like Dr. Kuumba, my desire to be an agent of change really was inspired by my mother, Maddie Myrick. And she was, and still I consider her, she's 90, she just turned 93 years old. And she still has fire and spunk. And although she is at a stage in life where she has developed dementia, I find that whenever I am with her, she always continues to inspire me. If I tell her about my day, about my work, what's going on, she will always give me some words of wisdom that are truly words of wisdom. So she still has that energy, that really spirit of someone who is a change agent and can inspire others to make change or to create change. However, I never really considered myself an activist in the traditional sense. Until recent years, I said, okay, well, I'll accept the label that people have seemed to bestowed upon me as a scholar activist. And then I started to think about that in terms of the things that I've done over time, all basically centered around education, access to education for our young people, access to education for people in the community, access to education that goes beyond the standard fare that our young people have gotten in most of the public school systems that exist in the country. And so I was involved in various initiatives in college, in graduate school, after I became a real full-fledged scholar or faculty person at an institution while at University of Cincinnati in the mid-90s, established with my husband a school, an independent school called the African American Academy. At the time, we naively went into that space of co-founding an independent independent school. It was not a public school, it was an independent school that was approved by and chartered by the state of Ohio, went through that entire process. I naively went into that process. I say that because Ohio was, and I think continues to be, an interesting place. If there were any Ohioans here, nothing negative meant by that. It just is. And Cincinnati in particular, at that time in the 90s, was a special place to be in. Our institution was African-centered. And we got a great deal of enthusiasm. There was a great deal of enthusiasm in the community. We were fortunate to actually be able to take over the lease of what had been a Catholic school. They moved on to someplace else. And so we were able to get that building along with many of the the supplies, school supplies that were left in that building. And so we established pre-K through 7th grade school. Again, this is the mid-90s. Initially, a great deal of enthusiasm in the community. And it was sustained for a good while in terms of the first two years or so. But as it turns out, everyone, when they say they want African-centered education, don't necessarily actually mean that. We made sure that everything we did in the curriculum was in line with the standards that were required by the state. We just made sure that it was done with an African-centered filter. But what occurred, long story short, the year of the Million Man March, it's been that long ago, it was at 95. We had members of our staff to travel to Washington, D.C. We closed early. When I opened the building the next morning, we received, I listened to the voicemail messages, and one was, and I'm just going to say what was said on that voicemail. It was a woman's voice, and she said, "We are going to kill all your nigger babies." And so that for me was a moment of understanding that just by attempting to establish an educational institution for our children that recognized, acknowledged, and used as a point of entry our history and culture, we were considered radicals, activists, or people who were attempting to change the system. And indeed we were, but never imagined, again, I was naive, never imagined that it would elicit that kind of response from individuals in the community who were reacting to the Million Man March and what that signified, and also reacting to, I guess, the audacity of individuals in that context of Cincinnati just to establish a school that specifically is about teaching our children using an African-centered perspective. We immediately received, and we got that call, that voicemail. We got the police in, they brought the dogs in, we closed the school for the day. My husband and I stayed. And then we actually were so astonished, amazed, and grateful for the presence of the Nation of Islam. They actually posted men at the school for, I think, a 2-week period, so that we were able to open up and continue to teach. That experience ended when we were not able to, or the state of Ohio was not able to establish the voucher system. The voucher system was perceived as a negative thing by many Black activists, NAACP, SELC. We saw it as an opportunity to utilize funds that have been allocated for the education of our children to provide that choice that our children so often did not have, whether to go to public or private school. And so that did not occur. So in any case, long story short, we closed that institution, moved to Atlanta. We started doing things virtually in terms of online programs, educational programs, and we started what was called One World Archives, which was focused on creating in the early 2000s, and this was primarily my husband, who was a digital wizard, a computer wizard, self-taught primarily. And so that's where my interest in technology, digital media, and archiving our history through digital media really was first sparked. And I'm taking more time than I'm allocated, so I'm going to move along much more quickly. I just want to talk about my point of entry. But I have a couple of links that I wanted to share. And if I could get permission to share a screen. Hello?
Yes, we'll make you a host now so you can share.
Okay, and I'll be quick. Okay.
You should be able to share now.
Okay. Okay. Okay, and I'm just going to go through several of the initiatives I've worked with in recent years very quickly. Back in 2004, 2005, the Atlanta Regional Council for Higher Education launched a project called Atlanta in the Civil Rights Movement. And the initial phase of that project was the creation of an actual website. I hope I can get to it from here. Okay, and the website was down for years and years. It was up, and it was, and it was done by an independent vendor, Point of Vision, and it very kind of basic. But there was a photo gallery, as you see here, with images. And the purpose of this was to do a survey of all of the archives in the network of higher education institutions that were part of ARCH, the Atlanta University Center, Georgia State, University of Georgia, Oglethorpe, Kennesaw, and on and on and on. And so I was among the researchers. They contracted to actually go into the archives of these various institutions, including Woodruff Library, the special collections, to actually document what was there. Then a source, and nowadays this looks so rudimentary, so wow. But this is the database that was created. I don't know if it still works, quite frankly, but you could put a name or phrase, let's see, into this space, and then you would get a listing of the, okay, it still works a little bit. Okay, it does work. That's wonderful to see. You get a listing of the different archives, different collections, where you had information on that individual, that event. And Atlanta History Center was also a part of this, as well as the Auburn Avenue Research Library. So we did research to actually provide a database of all the collections related to civil rights, especially Atlanta and the civil rights movement, that would be searchable. So that's still there. They restored that recently. That's great to see. And then I did an essay. Actually, my husband worked with me on this, and we did an essay documenting, telling the story of Atlanta's involvement in the civil rights movement on local level, national level, in these time frames, 40 to 49, 50 to 59, 60 to 65, and 60 to 70. Okay, and so on. Then we also provide web resources, did an extensive bibliography and timeline. Let's see. Go back to home. Okay, now it's not.
Dr. Myrick-Harris?
Yeah.
I don't mean to interrupt, but we can only see your PowerPoint slide.
Oh my goodness.
As you're moving between the PowerPoint and your browser.
Oh, you cannot see the screen, the page for the Atlanta Civil Rights Movement.
Yeah, we shared the link in the chat so that folks can see what it's like, but we want to make sure that we're navigating with you.
Understood. Well, I'm going to come out of that then. And so I don't know that it really is even necessary for me to share. Well, yeah, I'll do that so you can copy the link, since you cannot see the actual. So let me share again. Okay, and I know I need to speed up, and so I will do that. Oops, let me start over. Oops. Share screening stopped. Let's try it again. Okay. Do you see this now?
We can still see the PowerPoint slide.
Okay, and that's fine. And then the next link, if you could put this link into the chat, that would be good. I won't go to the actual, the timeline that I had that connected to, but this is a project that I worked on for the 100th anniversary commemoration of the 1906 Atlanta race riot or Atlanta massacre. And in terms of, there were students involved in this work at the time, and who assisted me. I was one of the curators of the exhibit that was done for that, and utilized students for archival research, as well as doing research on my own. I'm bringing this up because a lot of work was done for this. We had an exhibit that was an on-the-ground exhibit that was at the King site, the Martin Luther King Jr. site. In hindsight, I said that should have been recorded. That exhibit should have been recorded. We did oral history interviews, and I will confess that I still have a number of those interviews in my personal collection or collection of OWA, of the One World Archives. And it's the kind of thing that needs to be archived at Woodruff Library or Auburn Avenue Research Library. And so a part of what I think is important for you all as archivists to do is to sometimes actively seek out these materials, documents, images, videos, to be added to collections. And that's where you get into those issues related to restriction and privacy. In terms of the current initiative I'm working with, the Atlanta Student Movement Initiative, we've done about 3 virtual conversations. The first back in October of last year. And we did a couple others in partnership with other institutions. One is the Points of Light organization, believe it or not. And then the third is was with the University of Minnesota, a conversation on activism in the civil rights movement and social justice movements among students. And that involved, each of these conversations involved both veterans of the movement and students. That issue of privacy and restrictions comes in, I found in this work with the Atlanta Student Movement Initiative. Individuals, sometimes, first of all, let me just acknowledge, there is a terrific collection at the AUC Woodruff Library Special Collections. There was a wonderful exhibit, starting something that's still, I think part of it's still available. There's a wonderful collection that is accessible to individuals. So that is a very good thing. And I'm skipping forward because I know I'm taking much more time than I'm supposed to. The challenge that I'm finding as I talk with students who are involved in student activism today is that they don't necessarily have an appreciation for the fact that they need to document what they're doing, and they don't know how to do that. Their primary medium is social media. And that's where I think the challenge is, and I'm pleased that you're going to be addressing this in this conference. How do you preserve social media posts from Twitter, from Instagram, Facebook, and all the others that I don't even know the names of, because they use so many different social media platforms these days? You have the issue of ownership, restrictions regarding, retrieving of information from these sites and storage in a particular facility. How do you do that? And then how do our institutions, our HBCUs in particular, develop their own mechanisms for owning these materials that document this important history that is going on now? We are living in unprecedented times in terms of student activism. The only immediate precedent that I can think of is the 1960s. And of course, we know that even before that, in the 1920s, there was a movement across HBCU campuses led by students. But this, in terms of the current generation, is something that 50 years from now, 100 years from now, we want them to be able to look back and see what these young people have done. So how do we ensure that we can convince our students to be aware that this information needs to be preserved? And then how do we take their primarily virtual material, their announcements, their flyers? How do we then take that and preserve that, making sure that there are no restrictions in terms of ownership and so on? So I'm going to stop there. I've talked way too long, and apologies for that. But if there are any questions.
No, we thank you for all that you've shared. Would you mind stop sharing your screen?
Yes.
And then we can get together in conversation. So you both have shared so much, and I don't mind you going over time at all, because you've been able to touch on some of the things that I know I've called out, and our facilitators have called out. And thank you again for kind of going back to our themes about privacy and digitization. So I think maybe from the top, and I'm gonna roughly quote one of our fellows, Ashby, mentioned yesterday, an interest in womanist consciousness in archiving and making sure that Black women and femmes are brought up in the archive. Both of you have a lot of experience and engage your activism and your scholarship in Black feminist lenses, womanist lenses, within the African diaspora and transnational experiences. And Dr. Myrick-Harris, you jokingly in the warm-up said, you're old school, and so like you gotta transition. But I immediately thought that the practice of care that happens over time in dealing with and working with donors, working with different types of archival materials. Can you both talk about a little bit more, first, what does the archival work look like in these international contexts? And then what are some really important and unique big picture considerations for both archivists and activists in being able to capture that movement building work? I know it's a big question, right? But I really want y'all to like really get into it, because Dr. Kuumba, are you?
What I think about first, I'm actually, I just, you gave me so much to think about, Dr. Myrick-Harris, especially, and thinking about having a womanist or feminist or Black feminist or radical feminist lens on student activism. I would first say that part of the issue is the broader issue of being, of women's activism and activist strategies often being invisible or hidden or undocumented. I mean, that's one of the issues. And I'll take Spelman College as an example, and why documenting is so important is that many of our students don't even know the history of activism at our institutions. Meaning part of the first step is unearthing those herstories, which oftentimes are not written down, are not taped, are not, and so the students at Spelman don't know about how students and faculty locked the Board of Trustees up at one of their meetings to get a Black woman as president. Like, they don't know about Dazon Dixon, Jallo, and Laylee, who was Laylee Phillips at the time, creating shanties on the campus in the 80s to force Spelman College and the AUC to divest. They don't know, and it's so great that the Atlanta student movement is highlighted and the exhibit at Woodruff Library, because they don't know that, for instance, those students were confronted by the administrations of their colleges, and that those colleges did not support their activism wholeheartedly, just like this Spelman College did not support the students that were activists against misogynistic representations of Black women in, with Nellie and others. So that's part of the importance, I think, of documenting that so we can go back and show the tradition. And I think going back to how do we archive? Now, I don't have any answers on the digital side of it, but when I was mentioning the Wild Archive, part of it is us, I guess, as the OGs also being in those spaces, or those spaces becoming student activist spaces. I'm thinking about my office for one thing. Oftentimes, that not only my office, but the Women's Center becomes a place of activism, or where it's being fertilized. And so there are remnants that are left. I mean, I remember my qualitative research methods where we would talk about, attrition and what is that? And when things build up as unobtrusive measures. And so there are documents and fans and stickers and posters and everything that gets left, which oftentimes we don't even see the significance in, but they're really they're the remnants, they're the documents, they're the experiences that we need to pass on, not just and I guess my last thing I'll say is, and I was just talking about this weekend at another seminar, we need to know like the names, the places, but we need to move beyond what I call liberation libations. The libations that we often do at our cultural events where we just like call out names, Harriet Tubman, Ashe, Sojourner Truth, Ashe, but I'm calling, and I think our student activists need for us to actually delve into not just the surface level of the names and the places and the things and the events, but what they did, what their strategies were, what their thinking was. I mean, as much as we can put that together so that we can fold that back into the activism that exists today. And those are things I just thought about as you were presenting. So thank you.
Yeah, agreed, Dr. Kuumba. And really that's one of the goals of the Atlanta Student Movement Initiative, to expose students, and not just expose, I hate the word expose, but to really allow them to interact directly, to see, to witness, and yet call out the names because they don't know the names. But as you say, delve more deeply into what the strategies of the activists and both the women and men who were involved in the student movement. We did a session in March of this year called The Women, the tradition of women activism in the civil rights and the current movement, Black Lives Matter movement. And actually Beverly was a part of that panel, as well as a couple of other veterans of the movement. And we had students. We had a Spelman student who was a part of that, who talked about her activism. And she's participating in Cynthia Neal Spence's program, Social Justice Initiative. And what I found is that the veterans, and they have been very clear. Yes, they have stories to tell and students can learn lessons, but they're excited about learning lessons from these students in terms of their strategies. And they say, boy, if we had some of the things they have now, we could have taken over the world. We could have ruled the world. We could have changed the world. That's what they've been saying. So that indeed is very important. And what we're doing at Morehouse, we've just established a minor in public history led by Karchik Sims Alvarado. And so having the students involved in not only those classes for the minor, but specific projects that are about documenting this history. We have a group of students who are creating an app around the Atlanta student movement. Karchik is actually creating an outdoor exhibit that will be, and she's using student workers to help with that process. We have had to postpone our symposium 2 times because of COVID. We wanted to have at least a part of it in person on campus, doesn't look like it's going to happen. So we are going to have our symposium in like two parts. The first part at end of October, and we're trying to finalize that date with our speakers, presenters. It is going to be focused on political empowerment of African Americans. You know, this is around the time of the election, and we've regressed in so many ways in terms of political voting rights and just political power in general. So that's that. And then our exhibition will open now in March when we have the second part of that symposium. But it is so very important that students understand the importance of preserving the work they're doing, because when you're in it, you don't think about that. And what I am so pleased about is that our veterans of the civil rights movement, as Andrea and Sarah will attest, they kept everything. They kept so much, they kept everything, you know, the flyers, you know, the buttons, they had a sense of the historical significance of what they were doing. And so they preserve these things. And even though we have sometimes hesitancy among some to share, for the most part, they did, and they are sharing their stories. So that's a good thing. It is our students that we have to really help change their mindset so they understand not only the importance of doing what they do, but the importance of making sure there's a record of it, because memories are so short, as we all know. And unless we have that documentation, then that next generation, as 50 years from now, won't know this is, won't be able to learn from it and carry on the traditions.
I'm gonna flag for my facilitators. I'm gonna ask 3 questions. I know we only have 13 minutes, but I want to ask one for each of our experts and then one for both of them to respond to. Dr. Kuumba, so you mentioned this wild archive again, and even just in our conversation yesterday, I have constantly had to reframe and rethink about what is an archive, what is archival work. Mm-hmm. So how does your practice in having the wild archive transcend beyond when we think of the traditional boundaries of archive? And really thinking about, so are you intending to donate that to Spelman at some point? Do you, in your practice with students, are you helping them to make decisions about privacy, about ethics, about what can be used, what should be saved for after? Like, how do you engage your students in the wild archive and keeping up with where we're going in digitizing?
I was trying to avoid that. But it happens to everybody. I had to unmute. Okay. Well, first of all, I have to give credit for the language of the Wild Archives to my sister colleague, Femi Ajanaku, who she and I went to graduate school together. And she initially was using the concept of, in her research, for instance, how in terms of Black women activists who oftentimes don't know that they're activists until you name it, because they're just doing what needs to be done. And the fact that documents that supported their work could be found like stuffed in a Bible or in a box somewhere, or just could be a letter, a card between activists that they might not have even realized is something that needs to be saved. And so, I don't know about the ethics and privacy aspects of it, but I just know from my experience as an activist, I mean, all of the, and my persona as not a hoarder, but hoarding tendencies, my daughter says, especially when it comes to activist stuff, and just how significant, how I have been able to draw from even my own wild archives. I mean, stuff that I've kept over the years, that's kind of given me a sensibility about when the students are doing their work, I'm kind of behind them collecting stuff, knowing as an activist that, yeah, when you're in the thick of it, you're just trying to put the flyers up. You're just trying to wheat paste for African Liberation Day. You're not making notes about the conversation, or you might be making notes, but you're not thinking about how those might be valuable in the future. So a lot of times I'm coming up behind them, collecting and encouraging both myself and Dr. Beverly Guy-Sheftall and Cynthia Neal Spence too, encouraging, after their campaigns, to put together all of what they worked on, to send it over to Holly in the archives so that we have record. Even Beverly Guy-Sheftall is really good too about stressing the fact, not only has she documented, for instance, the activist work that she's had to be engaged in creating the Women's Center, but really has stressed even to the students the fact that they need to preserve what they've been working on, preserve their conversations, their strategy sessions, preserve the digitized images that they have. And thank goodness we have the archives that is part of the Women's Center that we can direct that material to.
Yes.
Thank you. And Dr. Myrick-Harris, so you mentioned the Atlanta Student Movement Initiative and all of the things that you're doing to facilitate that intergenerational conversation. Where have you had to learn real quickly or help to advise others in this digital preservation process? When folks, I'm reclaiming hoarding this week for myself because I was a student organizer, in the NAACP, and we kept everything in that office. But as students, transition, where does that stuff go if it's not safe at the institution? If it becomes then a wild archive. So how have you been able to, work with current students and folks in the past for this digital preservation process? What are the challenges? Some advice that you can give for others?
Katherine, this is a new project. And so really we're just tackling these issues. And I think a challenge that we will have, and that we, in our public history initiative and our public history program, will work to change the mindsets of our students. They keep everything on their devices, on their phones, on their laptops, on their tablets. And so we don't have in many cases these days, we don't have the physical hard copy of much of what they are distributing via social media. And so I see that as the challenge that all of you here who are in this a part of this Project Stand initiative will help us to resolve in terms of that whole notion of privacy and restrictions and just in dealing with those platforms, dealing with Twitter and Instagram and so on. What are the protocols? Are there any existing policies regarding preservation of social media posts in archives and higher ed college and university archives? So I need your input in terms of that. This is a program that we are really just getting off the ground. And it was not initially intended to be primarily a virtual kind of initiative. Before COVID hit, we were planning to do all these things in the real world. We were going to do an app that was a part of what we had planned from originally, but it was primarily going to be in the real world. And then we had to very swiftly switch to the virtual realm and develop these intergenerational virtual conversations. And so we have these, but the question is, we need to have a conversation with Sarah and Holly about what do we do with these conversations that we've had and that we will continue to have. Then you have the whole notion or the added factor in terms of we partner with other organizations to do some of these conversations to date. And in terms of ownership, do we both get copies of the recording? That's good, but we need agreements for that. And so there are all these things that are really just popping into our heads as things that we have to deal with as we attempt to document, to archive, and really to make accessible this information, widely accessible. The wonderful thing about digital media, the wonderful thing about social media is that it has provided access. It provides instant access to people all over the world. But when when that event is over, what then happens to all those posts? What happens to all those digital flyers? And how do we go about doing that in a way that makes sure that we have ownership of the materials that have been produced and are not at risk? There's some organization or some platform essentially saying, no, you don't own it, it's ours because it was distributed on our platforms. So that's an issue that I would be very, very, very interested in the archivists who gathered here to help us deal with. I know there have been some things written about this. There's a woman named Lisa Lindstrom who's written a paper on this particular challenge of archiving social media of activism. And so there's some ideas in there, but I would really love to get some ideas from your perspectives.
Thank you. 4 more minutes for my last question. We did that so great. My last question for both of you. What are some considerations you both have regarding ethical documentation of Black history and contemporary lives? I know we've talked a little bit about the private, the privacy, and I know folks have questions regarding those 2 areas, but taking just a step back in a big picture, what are things that first activists should know that aren't necessarily right, but should know in their engagement with archivists? And what are some things that archivists should lean into, develop an instinct for, some guidance or criteria when it comes to documenting Black lives right now? Because you're right, I think privacy policy, social media is moving so quickly, but those things are also very, very behind because those platforms won't respond in a way that protects Black lives and activists. So what are some, in this new day and age, what are some things that our fellows should be thinking through when it comes to ethics?
Well, Kuumba?
Well, you know what? I am thinking, and I don't know if this fits into the ethics box, but I think that from an activist archivist perspective, if that's a thing, that part of it has to also include advocacy, student advocacy. And I guess sometimes it's seen as unethical, which is a problem, to be on a side, like to be supporting student activism versus neutrality or being passive. And what I found is that you really have to forget about the old ideas of objectivity or what is ethical from that perspective, and think in terms of what's ethical. And this is going to sound very laudie, but for the people, like not necessarily for the institution, but in progressing the goals of liberation and expanding human rights. And so sometimes in our institutions, that creates a conflict or tension. And this is bringing to mind my open letter to protest the Spelman College student protest policy, where I was positioned kind of between the students and the institution, and trying to use what we know, what's documented about student activism, and even at, for instance, Spelman College, where Harry Lefevre documented it, for instance, if you ever read Undaunted by the Fight, where he analyzes, it looks at Spelman's students and the fact that at that time in the 60s, Spelman College was not necessarily on the right side of history in terms of supporting a Ruby Doris Smith Robinson, for example, in her activity and her having to fight to even get back in school. So one of the things that I've urged our campus, and I think that we all as faculty and staff at HBCUs need to I guess, kind of throw these institutions' histories in their faces in a way that where they validate, where they value student activism and its documentation, as opposed to the knee-jerk reaction, which is always to squelch that. And I just want to, just a little bit of what I wrote in the letter, actually, I hope I can get to it fast enough. Therefore, as a Spelman College faculty member and scholar activist and woman of African descent who has made a choice to change the world, I protest the creation of any Spelman College protest policy that does not vehemently support, encourage, and protect students' rights to engage in social justice activism and protest without permission. So I think that as the role of an advocate and activist, where we can be not only documenting, but also promoting and validating the students' actions, which sometimes can be disruptive. I think that that's ethical.
Yes.
The new ethics.
Just quickly add, Dr. Kuumba, thank you. What you said is so important. To tell the true story, the whole story, because most of the institutions in the AU Center did not, for instance, support the Atlanta student movement. There were a couple of exceptions. The head of the president of ITC, and then the president of Morris Brown College, and they eventually brought the other presidents around to some extent, in any case, but. Knowing that history is important and sharing that history with current administrations, because hey, you don't want to be on the wrong side of history in this. Look what happened back here. Look what happened at that point. So that's very important, and it's also important to provide that context and the historical context, so that our archival materials are not taken in isolation. And so that there's a full understanding of the significance, and to some extent, so that various things can be corroborated, verified. Make sure we look at a variety of sources that speak to what was going on in a particular event, march, demonstration, a particular initiative. So all of that is extremely, extremely important. And just in terms of our archivists that we have represented here, the archivists that we have represented here, what that means is that you have to be proactive and contact those student groups that exist on your campuses, engage them, bring them in, give them some lunch, and begin to help them understand the importance of contributing what they're doing, the artifacts, the ephemera, whatever, the digital representations of what they're doing to the archive, so that history will be preserved.
Thank you both. And seeing the time, I'm going to invite Lael or Brittany to transition us. Thank you very much, both of you, for sharing a little bit about your work and your wisdom. I'm looking forward to the next half hour and seeing what the fellows have for us.
Thank you.
Thank you for inviting us.
Yes. Take care.